In the frozen reaches of ancient Skyrim, beneath perpetual storms of ice and shadow, a civilization once thrived that would reshape the very foundations of Nordic history. The Snow Elves, known in their own tongue as the Falmer, commanded an empire of crystalline spires and arcane mastery that rivaled even the greatest Aldmeri kingdoms of the south. Yet their story is not one of gradual decline or peaceful transition, but of desperate rebellion against forces that would drive them into the deepest darkness imaginable. What began as territorial disputes between Nordic settlers and the indigenous Snow Elves escalated into something far more catastrophic, a series of events so brutal and transformative that they would echo through the ages, creating legends that still whisper through the wind-carved valleys of modern Skyrim. The rebellion of the Snow Elves represents one of the most tragic and complex conflicts in Tamrielic history, a war that would see an entire race choose damnation over defeat. But to understand the true magnitude of this rebellion, we must first journey back to a time when the Snow Elves ruled supreme over the northern reaches of Tamriel. Before the arrival of Ysgramor and his 500 companions, before the first Nordic settlements carved their crude halls from ancient stone, the Falmer had already established a civilization that harmonized with the harsh beauty of their frozen homeland, in ways that seem almost mythical to modern scholars. The Snow Elves were not merely survivors in Skyrim's unforgiving climate, they were masters of it. Their cities rose like natural formations from the mountainsides, crafted from ice that never melted and stone that sang with enchanted resonance. The capital of their realm, whose true name has been lost to time, but which Nordic accounts refer to as the Sanctum of Eternal Winter, stood as a testament to their architectural genius. Towers of translucent ice spiraled impossibly high, their surfaces carved with intricate patterns that channeled and focused magical energies in ways that contemporary mages can barely comprehend. The Falmer possessed an understanding of frost magic that surpassed even the most accomplished Nordic wizards of later eras. They could shape ice with the precision of master craftsmen, creating weapons that held edges sharper than steel and armor that provided protection, while weighing no more than silk. Their mastery extended beyond mere manipulation of frozen water to encompass the very essence of cold itself. Ancient texts speak of Falmer sorcerers who could freeze the breath in an enemy's lungs or draw the warmth from a warrior's blood without ever touching their target. Their society operated according to principles that emphasized harmony with the natural forces of their environment rather than domination over them. The Falmer viewed the endless winter not as an obstacle to overcome, but as a source of power to be channeled and respected. Their religious practices centered around the veneration of Oriel, whom they understood not as the distant solar deity worshipped by other Aldmeri peoples, but as the eternal guardian of the frozen peaks who granted them dominion over ice and snow. And the hierarchy of Snow Elf society reflected their spiritual beliefs, with those most attuned to the forces of winter holding positions of greatest authority. The Archcurate of Oriel served as both temporal and spiritual leader, chosen not through hereditary succession, but through demonstration of unparalleled mastery over frost magic and deep communion with their deity. Beneath this figure, a council of curates governed different aspects of Falmer civilization, each specializing in particular applications of their people's unique magical abilities. These specializations created a remarkably sophisticated division of labor that allowed Falmer society to thrive in conditions that would have destroyed most other civilizations. The Shapers carved their cities from living ice, constantly maintaining and expanding the structures through continuous magical intervention. The Wardens protected the borders of their territory, using their frost magic to create barriers that could turn away even the most determined invaders. The Seers communicated with the spirits of the mountain peaks, gathering intelligence about distant events and potential threats to their people. The arrival of human refugees from Atmora initially appeared to pose little threat to this established order. The first Nordic settlers, fleeing the civil wars that ravaged their homeland, arrived in small groups that struggled merely to survive in Skyrim's hostile environment. The Snow Elves, secure in their mastery of the region, initially viewed these newcomers with a mixture of curiosity and condescension. Here were primitives who could barely construct adequate shelter against the winter storms, let alone challenge a civilization that had thrived for millennia. Early interactions between the two peoples followed patterns of cautious coexistence rather than open hostility. Some Falmer settlements even provided limited assistance to struggling human communities, offering guidance on which areas offered the best protection from winter storms or which plants could be safely harvested for food during the harsh months. This assistance came not from altruism, but from practical calculation. The Snow Elves recognized that helping the humans establish stable settlements would prevent the desperate raiding that might otherwise threaten Falmer territory. However, this delicate balance began to shift as more Atmarans arrived in Skyrim, bringing with them not only greater numbers, but also more sophisticated tools and weapons. The early Nordic settlers had possessed little beyond basic survival skills and primitive metalworking techniques. The later waves of immigration included warriors, craftsmen, and leaders who had learned valuable lessons from their struggles in Atmora and were determined to carve out permanent holdings in their new homeland. The transformation of these scattered human settlements into organized communities capable of expansion and territorial control created the first serious tensions between the two races. What had begun as isolated groups of refugees struggling for survival evolved into a growing network of Nordic settlements that began to impinge upon areas the former considered their exclusive domain. The humans, driven by necessity and ambition, cleared forests that the Snow Elves had preserved for centuries, drained wetlands that served as crucial components of local magical ecosystems, and established permanent structures in locations that had previously remained untouched by settlement. The philosophical differences between the two peoples made peaceful resolution of these conflicts increasingly difficult. The Falmer approached territorial control through spiritual and magical means, establishing dominion over regions by harmonizing with their natural magical currents rather than through physical occupation. They viewed the human approach of clear-cutting, mining, and intensive agriculture as a form of spiritual vandalism that disrupted the delicate balance they had spent generations cultivating. The Nords, for their part, brought with them cultural values that emphasized individual achievement, territorial expansion, and the transformation of wilderness into productive farmland. Their concept of land ownership involved active use and improvement, making the Falmer approach of maintaining large areas in their natural state appear to be nothing more than wasteful abandonment of valuable resources. These fundamental differences in worldview made compromise extremely difficult, as each side interpreted the other's actions through the lens of their own cultural assumptions. Religious differences further complicated the growing tensions between the two peoples. The Nordic pantheon, with its emphasis on martial prowess and the conquest of adversity, stood in stark contrast to the Falmer's reverence for natural harmony and magical attunement. The arrival of Nordic priests, who proclaimed the superiority of their gods and actively sought to convert local populations, created additional friction, particularly when these missionary efforts extended to human settlements that had previously maintained respectful relationships with nearby farmer communities. The Snow Elves' response to these challenges initially followed traditional patterns of magical intervention, rather than direct military confrontation. Falmer wardens began establishing more aggressive territorial boundaries, using their frost magic to create impassable barriers around areas they considered sacred or strategically important. They summoned winter storms that lasted far longer than natural weather patterns would normally allow, making travel and agriculture difficult for human settlements in contested regions. Some communities reported that their water sources froze solid even during summer months, forcing them to relocate or face starvation. These magical interventions succeeded in slowing Nordic expansion, but also escalated the conflict by demonstrating the extent of Falmer power to human communities that had previously underestimated their elven neighbours. The realization that the Snow Elves possessed the ability to manipulate fundamental aspects of their environment created fear and resentment among the Nordic population, who began to view their continued presence in Skyrim as dependent upon the sufferance of a potentially hostile magical force. The situation reached a critical juncture when several Nordic settlements reported the complete disappearance of their populations during particularly severe winter storms. While the Falmer maintained that these disappearances resulted from natural disasters exacerbated by human encroachment on dangerous territories, the Nordic communities interpreted them as evidence of deliberate attacks using magical means. Whether these incidents represented intentional aggression or tragic accidents remains a matter of historical debate, but their impact on human perceptions of the Snow Elves proved catastrophic. Fear transformed into organized hostility as Nordic communities began coordinating their responses to what they perceived as an existential threat to their continued survival in Skyrim. The scattered settlements that had previously operated as independent entities began forming alliances and sharing information about Falmer activities in their regions. These early confederations marked the beginning of a more unified Nordic approach to dealing with their elven neighbours, setting the stage for the larger conflicts that would define the coming centuries. The Snow Elves, observing these developments with growing concern, faced a decision that would determine the fate of their civilization. They could attempt to negotiate a peaceful coexistence with the increasingly organized human population, potentially requiring significant concessions regarding territorial control and resource access. Alternatively, they could use their superior magical abilities to drive the human settlers from Skyrim entirely, preserving their traditional way of life, but potentially triggering a larger conflict with the Nordic homelands in Atmora. The choice they made would echo through the ages, setting in motion a sequence of events that would transform both peoples in ways neither could have anticipated. The decision reached by the Falmer leadership during those crucial winter councils would prove to be one of the most consequential in the history of Tamriel. Rather than seek accommodation with the growing Nordic presence, the Snow Elves chose to demonstrate the full extent of their magical supremacy. They believed that a decisive show of force would convince the human settlers to abandon their territorial ambitions and accept Falmer dominance over the northern reaches. This calculation, born from centuries of unchallenged mastery over their domain, would prove to be a catastrophic miscalculation that unleashed forces far beyond their control. The campaign that followed came to be known among the Snow Elves as the Great Cleansing, though Nordic accounts would remember it by far more sinister names. Falmer warbands emerged from their mountain strongholds with a coordination and magical power that caught the scattered human settlements completely unprepared. These were not the cautious territorial skirmishes that had characterized earlier conflicts, but systematic assaults designed to eliminate the Nordic presence entirely from contested regions. The Falmer approach to warfare differed fundamentally from the direct martial traditions that would later characterize Nordic combat. Rather than engaging in open battle where superior numbers might provide advantages to their enemies, the Snow Elves employed their mastery over winter itself as their primary weapon. Entire valleys would wake to find themselves encased in ice so thick that even the strongest warriors could not break free from their frozen homes. Blizzards would descend upon traveling parties with supernatural intensity, disorienting and separating groups until individuals wandered lost in the white until cold and exhaustion claimed them. Perhaps most terrifying were the ice wraiths that accompanied Falmer war parties during their raids. These elemental constructs, animated through ancient magical techniques that bound winter spirits to crystalline forms, could pass through wooden walls and stone barriers as easily as walking through morning mist. They left no physical wounds upon their victims, instead draining the very warmth from their bodies until Nordic warriors collapsed into eternal sleep. The psychological impact of these attacks proved as devastating as their physical effects. as survivors spread tales of ghostly figures that could strike without warning and against which conventional weapons offered no protection. The magical superiority demonstrated during these early engagements convinced many Falmer leaders that their campaign would achieve swift and decisive victory. Human settlements abandoned their territories in the face of supernatural assault, with entire communities fleeing southward rather than face the inexorable advance of winter made manifest. For a brief period, it appeared that the Snow Elves had successfully reasserted their dominion over Skyrim through the simple expedient of demonstrating their overwhelming magical advantages. However, the very success of these initial assaults created consequences that the Falmer leadership had failed to anticipate. The refugees flooding southward carried with them accounts of the supernatural powers arrayed against them, stories that grew more terrifying with each retelling. These tales reached not only other Nordic settlements within Skyrim, but also travelled across the Sea of Ghosts to the remaining population centres in Atmora. What had begun as a regional conflict between neighbours escalated into something far larger as the human survivors depicted their struggle as nothing less than a war for the survival of their entire race. The response from Atmora came in the form of Ysgramor himself, the legendary Nordic hero whose reputation had already spread throughout the human settlements of both continents. His arrival in Skyrim marked a fundamental shift in the nature of the conflict, transforming what had been a series of territorial disputes into an existential struggle between two incompatible visions of civilization. Ysgramor brought with him not merely additional warriors, but organizational skills and strategic thinking that had been largely absent from the scattered human resistance efforts. More significantly, Ysgramor's expedition included individuals who possessed knowledge of magical techniques specifically designed to counter the frost magic that had given the Falmer such decisive advantages in earlier engagements. These countermeasures had been developed through careful study of the accounts provided by refugees, combined with ancient Nordic traditions of fire magic that had been largely abandoned during the migrations from Atmora. The systematic application of these techniques would prove crucial in the battles that followed. The 500 companions who accompanied Ysgramor represented the finest warriors that Atmora could provide, each selected not only for martial prowess, but for their ability to function effectively in the supernatural conditions that characterized warfare against the Snow Elves. These warriors carried weapons specifically enchanted to resist ice magic, wore armor treated with alchemical preparations that provided protection against frost damage, and had trained extensively in combat techniques designed to counter the ethereal movements of ice wraiths and other elemental constructs. The first major engagement between Ysgramor's forces and the Falmer armies occurred in the valley that would later be known as the Throat of the World, though at that time it bore a different name in the Snow Elf tongue. The battle itself lasted for 3 days and nights, with neither side able to achieve decisive advantage despite deploying their most powerful capabilities. The Falmer called upon winter storms of unprecedented intensity, while the Nordic forces countered with fire magic and coordinated tactical maneuvers that prevented their enemies from achieving the isolation and division that had proven so effective against earlier human settlements. The stalemate that emerged from this engagement forced both sides to reconsider their strategic approaches to the conflict. The Snow Elves realized that their traditional magical superiority would not guarantee swift victory against opponents who had specifically prepared to counter their abilities. The Nords, meanwhile, gained valuable insight into the true extent of Falmer power and the challenges they would face in any prolonged campaign against an enemy that could manipulate the very environment to their advantage. It was during the aftermath of this inconclusive battle that the conflict took on its most tragic dimensions. Faced with the prospect of a prolonged war against increasingly sophisticated opponents, some Falmer leaders began to advocate for more extreme measures that would guarantee their survival, regardless of the cost to their traditional values and cultural identity. These voices argued that the very existence of their people took precedence over maintaining the spiritual harmony that had defined their civilization for millennia. The proposal that emerged from these desperate deliberations would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. Deep beneath the mountains of Skyrim lay extensive cave systems that had remained largely unexplored, even by the Falmer themselves. These underground networks offered the possibility of retreat to locations where Nordic forces could never follow, providing absolute security at the cost of abandoning the surface territories that had sustained their civilization since time immemorial. More controversial still was the alliance that certain Falmer factions began to contemplate with the Dwemer, the mysterious deep elves whose underground cities had remained largely isolated from surface conflicts. The Dwemer possessed technological capabilities that could complement Falmer magical knowledge, potentially creating defensive capabilities that could withstand any surface assault. However, such an alliance would require accepting Dwemer terms and conditions that many Snow Elves found philosophically repugnant. The debate that raged within Falmer society over these proposals revealed fundamental divisions that had previously remained hidden beneath the surface of their apparently unified culture. Traditional conservatives argued that retreat underground would represent the abandonment of everything that made their civilization worth preserving, transforming them into something fundamentally different from the people who had mastered the surface world through harmony with natural forces. Progressive factions countered that survival took precedence over cultural purity, and that adaptation to new circumstances represented the only realistic path forward in the face of overwhelming human numbers and determination. These internal divisions weakened Falmer resistance efforts at precisely the moment when unity would have been most crucial for their survival. While their leaders debated strategy and philosophy, Ysgramor's forces consolidated their positions and prepared for the systematic conquest of Snow Elf territories. The Nordic approach emphasized methodical advancement rather than dramatic gestures, establishing secure supply lines and fortified positions that could support extended campaigns against an enemy whose magical abilities made conventional military planning extremely difficult. The psychological pressure created by this methodical advance proved as damaging to Falmer morale as any military defeat. The Snow Elves had built their identity around mastery of their environment and superiority over other peoples who lacked their magical capabilities. The demonstration that determined human opposition could neutralize these advantages and maintain sustained pressure against their territories called into question fundamental assumptions about their place in the world. As winter deepened and the conflict entered its most critical phase, both sides prepared for confrontations that would determine not merely territorial control, but the very survival of the Falmer civilization that had endured for countless generations in the frozen peaks of ancient Skyrim. The turning point in this ancient conflict came not through any single decisive battle, but through a series of smaller engagements that gradually revealed the true nature of the struggle unfolding across the frozen landscape. As the harsh winter months deepened, both the Snow Elves and the Nordic forces found themselves adapting to forms of warfare that neither had anticipated when the conflict began. The Falmer discovered that their traditional magical supremacy could be countered through careful preparation and tactical innovation, while Ysgramor's companions learned to navigate a supernatural battlefield where the very air itself could become a weapon. The most significant of these early encounters occurred in the shadow of what would later be called Winterhold, though the Nordic settlement that would bear that name lay centuries in the future. Here, a contingent of Falmer defenders had established what they believed to be an impregnable position, using their mastery over ice magic to create barriers that rose like crystalline walls from the mountainside. These fortifications incorporated architectural principles that merged magical theory with practical defensive design, creating structures that could channel and amplify the natural magical currents flowing through the region. The assault on these positions required Ysgramor's forces to develop entirely new approaches to siege warfare. Traditional Nordic tactics emphasized direct assault and overwhelming force, but such methods proved useless against defenses that could regenerate themselves through magical intervention. Instead, the human forces learned to employ patient undermining techniques, using controlled fire magic to gradually weaken the foundational ice structures while avoiding direct confrontation with the magical barriers themselves. The breakthrough came when Nordic scouts discovered that the Falmer fortifications drew their power from specific geographical features that channeled magical energy from deep within the earth. By identifying and disrupting these connection points, the human forces could cause entire sections of the ice walls to collapse without ever directly attacking the structures themselves. This tactical innovation demonstrated a level of strategic thinking that surprised even the Snow Elf commanders, who had underestimated their opponent's capacity for adaptive learning. The fall of the Winterhold position sent shockwaves through Falmer society that extended far beyond its immediate military significance. For generations, the Snow Elves had maintained their dominance through technological and magical superiority that seemed absolute and unchangeable. The demonstration that human forces could not only counter their advantages, but actually turn them against their creators, called into question fundamental assumptions about the nature of power and the inevitability of Falmer supremacy. More disturbing still were the reports that began filtering back from the captured territories. Rather than simply occupying the lands they had taken, the Nordic forces were implementing systematic changes that seemed designed to permanently alter the magical characteristics of the region. They cleared ancient groves whose trees had been carefully cultivated to channel frost magic, drained pools that had served as focal points for winter rituals, and established settlements in locations that disrupted the natural flow of magical energies that the Falmer had spent centuries learning to manipulate. These actions revealed that the conflict had evolved beyond simple territorial dispute into something approaching cultural warfare. The humans were not merely seeking to control Falmer lands, but to transform them into something fundamentally incompatible with Snow Elf civilization. The magical ecosystems that supported traditional farmer society were being systematically dismantled and replaced with agricultural and settlement patterns that reflected Nordic values and priorities. The realization that their very way of life was under assault, rather than merely their political control, galvanized previously divided Falmer factions into unified opposition. Traditional conservatives who had opposed radical measures now found themselves advocating for desperate solutions that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. The preservation of their people began to take precedence over the preservation of their traditional territories, or even their surface-dwelling way of life. It was during this period of growing desperation that the first serious negotiations began with the Dwemer representatives who had previously maintained careful neutrality in the surface conflict. These deep elves possessed technological capabilities that could provide the Snow Elves with alternatives to their failing magical defenses, but such assistance came with conditions that many Falmer found deeply troubling. The Dwemer demanded not merely alliance but integration, requiring the Snow Elves to abandon their traditional magical practices in favor of technological solutions that aligned with deep elf philosophical principles. The debates that raged within former leadership councils during these crucial months revealed the full extent of the cultural crisis facing their civilization. Some argued that any compromise was preferable to extinction, pointing to the systematic destruction of their sacred sites, and the growing evidence that Nordic forces intended complete elimination rather than mere conquest. Others maintained that accepting Dwemer terms would represent a form of cultural suicide that differed from physical destruction only in its slower pace and greater subtlety. The complexity of these internal divisions was compounded by the varying responses of different farmer communities to the advancing crisis. Some settlements attempted to negotiate separate peace agreements with local Nordic commanders, offering tribute and territorial concessions in exchange for protection from further assault. Others chose to retreat deeper into the mountains, abandoning their traditional territories in favor of defensive positions that could be more easily defended against human attack. The most radical response came from Falmer communities that had suffered the heaviest losses during the early phases of the conflict. These groups began implementing scorched earth tactics that involved the deliberate destruction of their own sacred sites, rather than allowing them to fall into Nordic hands. Ancient temples were collapsed through magical intervention. Ritual artifacts were destroyed or hidden in locations where they could never be recovered, and entire libraries of magical knowledge were burned rather than risk capture by human forces. These desperate measures reflected the psychological transformation that was occurring within Falmer society as the reality of their situation became increasingly clear. The confident masters of the frozen peaks were being forced to confront the possibility that their civilization might not survive the current crisis. The prospect of cultural extinction created psychological pressures that manifested in increasingly extreme responses, ranging from fatalistic resignation to fanatical resistance. The military situation continued to deteriorate as Ysgramor's forces refined their tactics and expanded their territorial control throughout the winter months. The systematic nature of the Nordic advance demonstrated organizational capabilities that the Falmer had not anticipated from what they had initially dismissed as primitive barbarians. Each captured position was fortified and integrated into a growing network of defensive installations that could support further expansion while protecting against Falmer counterattacks. Perhaps most significantly, the human forces began demonstrating their own forms of magical capability that challenged Falmer assumptions about the exclusive nature of their supernatural powers. Nordic shamans and war priests employed techniques that drew upon different sources of a magical energy than the frost magic that dominated Snow Elf practices. These alternative approaches to supernatural manipulation proved surprisingly effective in countering traditional Falmer defensive measures. The emergence of Nordic magical practitioners created new tactical challenges for Snow Elf commanders who had based their strategies on assumptions of overwhelming supernatural superiority. The realization that their enemies possessed their own forms of magical knowledge, albeit derived from different traditions and principles, forced a fundamental re-evaluation of Falmer military doctrine. The comfortable certainty that had characterized their approach to warfare gave way to uncertainty and improvisation that proved increasingly inadequate against systematically advancing opponents. As spring approached and the immediate intensity of winter conditions began to moderate, both sides prepared for what many recognized would be the decisive phase of the conflict. The Falmer faced the choice between accepting devastating compromises that might ensure their physical survival at the cost of their cultural identity, or committing to a final desperate resistance that could result in their complete extinction. The decision they reached would determine not only their own fate, but establish precedents that would influence the development of Nordic civilization for centuries to come. The weight of these decisions fell most heavily upon the arch-curate of Ariel, whose traditional role as spiritual and temporal leader of the Snow Elves had become infinitely more complex as the crisis deepened. The ancient rituals and precedents that had guided Falmer leadership for millennia provided no clear guidance for responding to an existential threat that challenged the very foundations of their civilization. The choices that lay ahead would require not merely tactical wisdom, but fundamental decisions about the nature of survival itself and the price that could be accepted for continued existence. In the hidden councils held deep within the remaining Falmer strongholds, voices were raised in desperate debate over options that all recognized as variations of catastrophe. The path toward alliance with the Dwemer offered potential salvation, but at the cost of cultural transformation so complete that it might represent a form of extinction disguised as survival. The alternative of continued resistance promised the preservation of Falmer values and traditions, but offered increasingly slim prospects for physical survival against an enemy that had demonstrated both the capability and determination to achieve complete victory. The decision that emerged from those desperate councils would haunt the Snow Elves for generations beyond counting. In the deepest chambers of their mountain strongholds, where ancient ice formations bore witness to countless generations of Falmer wisdom, the arch-curate made the choice that would seal their fate. The alliance with the Dwemer was accepted, not as a partnership between equals, but as a desperate bargain struck by a people who had exhausted every other option for survival. The terms negotiated with the Deep Elves reflected the former's weakened position with brutal clarity. The Snow Elves would be granted sanctuary within the vast underground cities that the Dwemer had carved from the living rock beneath Skyrim's mountains. These subterranean refuges offered protection that no surface fortification could provide, sheltered behind barriers of stone and steam-powered mechanisms that even Ysgramor's most determined warriors could never breach. However, this sanctuary came with conditions that struck at the very heart of Falmer identity and culture. The Dwemer demanded complete abandonment of traditional Snow Elf magical practices in favour of technological solutions that aligned with their own philosophical principles. The frost magic that had defined former civilization for millennia was deemed incompatible with the carefully controlled environments of the underground cities. The Deep Elves maintained that their mechanical systems required precise atmospheric conditions that could not be maintained if magical energies were permitted to fluctuate according to the whims of traditional Falmer practitioners. More devastating still was the requirement that the Snow Elves consume a substance that the Dwemer claimed would facilitate their adaptation to underground life. This preparation, derived from a toxic fungus that grew in the deepest caverns, allegedly enhanced night vision and provided nutritional benefits that would sustain them in environments where traditional food sources were unavailable. The Dwemer presented this requirement as a practical necessity for survival in their underground realm, but the true nature of this substance would prove far more sinister than any Falmer leader could have imagined. The first groups of Snow Elves to enter the Dwemer cities reported initial relief at finding themselves safe from Nordic pursuit. The underground halls stretched for miles in every direction, carved with architectural precision that rivaled even the greatest Falmer achievements. Steam-powered mechanisms provided warmth and light, while carefully engineered water systems ensured adequate supplies for large populations. The technological marvels displayed throughout these installations demonstrated capabilities that even the most accomplished Falmer artificers could barely comprehend. However, the psychological impact of underground existence began manifesting almost immediately among the refugee populations. The Snow Elves had built their entire cultural identity around mastery of the surface world and harmony with natural forces that simply did not exist in the artificial environment of the Dwemer cities. The absence of seasonal cycles, the constant mechanical noise of steam engines, and the complete separation from the magical currents that had sustained their civilization for millennia created forms of spiritual distress that no amount of physical safety could address. The required consumption of the Dwemer fungal preparation initially appeared to provide some relief from these psychological pressures. The substance did indeed enhance vision in the perpetual twilight of the underground chambers, and it seemed to reduce the anxiety that many Snow Elves experienced in their new environment. However, these apparent benefits masked more subtle changes that became evident only after extended consumption. The fungus contained compounds that gradually altered brain chemistry in ways that affected both cognition and sensory perception. Within months of beginning regular consumption of the preparation, Falmer refugees began reporting changes in their thought patterns and emotional responses. The complex magical theory that had formed the intellectual foundation of their civilization became increasingly difficult to comprehend, as if the concepts themselves were fading from memory. The aesthetic appreciation for natural beauty that had inspired their greatest artistic achievements transformed into a growing preference for the mechanical precision and utilitarian design that characterized Dwemer architecture. More disturbing were the physical changes that accompanied these psychological transformations. The enhanced night vision provided by the fungal preparation came at the cost of increasing sensitivity to normal light levels. Snow Elves, who had once revelled in the brilliant reflections of sunlight on glacial ice, found themselves unable to tolerate even moderate illumination without experiencing severe pain. Their skin began to pale and take on a translucent quality that made the network of veins beneath clearly visible, while their hair lost its natural coloration and became brittle and white. The Dwemer observed these changes with what appeared to be scientific interest rather than concern. When Falmer leaders expressed alarm about the alterations occurring in their people, Deep Elf administrators explained that such modifications were necessary adaptations to underground life that would ultimately benefit the refugee populations. They maintained detailed records of the transformation process, documenting each stage of physical and psychological change with the methodical precision that characterized all their endeavors. The true horror of the situation became apparent only gradually as the cumulative effects of the fungal preparation reached critical thresholds. The Snow Elves who had entered the underground cities as refugees found themselves becoming something fundamentally different from what they had been. Their enhanced night vision developed into complete blindness under normal lighting conditions, forcing them to remain permanently within the artificial twilight of the Dwemer installations. Their cognitive abilities deteriorated to the point where complex reasoning became impossible, reducing their intellectual capacity to levels that barely supported basic survival functions. Perhaps most tragically, the transformation process erased their memories of surface life and their former cultural identity. The refugees, who had once been masters of frost magic and creators of crystalline cities, gradually lost all recollection of their previous existence. The Snow Elf language disappeared from their consciousness, replaced by crude vocalizations that served only the most basic communicative functions. The sophisticated social structures that had governed Falmer civilization for millennia collapsed as the transformed refugees became incapable of maintaining the complex relationships that such systems required. The Dwemer had effectively achieved what Nordic military force could not accomplish through direct assault. They had eliminated the Snow Elves as a distinct people while preserving their physical existence in a form that served Deep Elf purposes. The transformed Falmer became a labor force capable of performing simple tasks under Dwemer supervision while requiring minimal resources for maintenance. Their enhanced night vision and adaptation to underground conditions made them ideal workers for the dangerous mining operations that supported Deep Elf technology. This systematic dehumanization represented perhaps the most calculated genocide in Tamrielic history. Unlike the brutal but straightforward warfare that characterized most conflicts between different peoples, the Dwemer approach involved the complete erasure of Falmer identity while maintaining the appearance of providing sanctuary and assistance. The Deep Elves had solved the refugee crisis created by Nordic expansion through methods that preserved their own resources while eliminating any potential future threat from the displaced Snow Elf population. The few Falmer leaders who recognized the true nature of the transformation process found themselves powerless to prevent or reverse it. Those who attempted to warn their people or organize resistance discovered that the psychological effects of the fungal preparation made such efforts impossible. The transformed refugees had lost the capacity for abstract thinking that would have been necessary to understand their situation or coordinate opposition to their treatment. Some accounts suggest that small groups of Snow Elves managed to avoid the worst effects of the transformation by limiting their consumption of the required preparation or finding ways to neutralize its effects through magical intervention. These individuals allegedly maintained greater cognitive function and retained fragments of their original cultural identity, but they remained trapped within the Dwemer cities by their dependence on the controlled environment that the Deep Elves provided. The systematic nature of this transformation process reveals the extent to which the Dwemer had planned for the eventual subjugation of the Snow Elf refugees. The fungal preparation had been specifically developed to achieve the observed effects, suggesting that the Deep Elves had anticipated the Falmer's desperate need for sanctuary and prepared accordingly. The careful documentation of each stage of the process indicates that the transformation was not an unexpected side effect, but rather the intended outcome of the assistance they provided. Meanwhile, on the surface, Ysgramor's forces continued their systematic conquest of former Falmer territories, unaware that their primary opponents had effectively ceased to exist as an organized resistance. The Nordic advance encountered increasingly abandoned settlements as word of the Dwemer alliance spread among the remaining Snow Elf communities. Some Falmer groups chose to follow their leaders into the underground refuges, while others attempted to flee to more distant territories where they might establish new settlements beyond Nordic reach. The empty cities and abandoned strongholds that the human forces discovered told a story of sudden departure rather than military defeat. Valuable artifacts remained in place, suggesting that the evacuation had been conducted with the expectation of eventual return. The systematic destruction of magical infrastructure that had characterized earlier Falmer retreats was absent from these final abandonments, indicating that the Snow Elves who departed still hoped to preserve their cultural heritage for future restoration. These hopes would prove tragically misplaced. The Snow Elves who entered the Dwemer cities carried with them the accumulated knowledge and cultural traditions of their entire civilization. But the transformation process systematically erased these treasures from their consciousness. Millennia of magical research, artistic achievement, and philosophical development vanished as completely as if it had never existed, leaving no trace beyond the empty structures that dotted the surface landscape. The Nordic occupation of former Falmer territories proceeded with remarkable efficiency once organized resistance collapsed. Ysgramor's companions established permanent settlements in strategic locations, creating a network of human communities that could support continued expansion and defend against any potential counterattack. The systematic clearing of magical infrastructure continued, as the new occupiers sought to eliminate any possibility that the displaced Snow Elves might return to reclaim their former dominance. The transformation of these territories from centers of Falmer magical civilization to Nordic agricultural and trading communities represented a fundamental shift in the character of Skyrim itself. The careful balance between natural forces and magical intervention that had characterized Snow Elf land management gave way to more intensive exploitation of natural resources. Ancient forests were cleared for farmland, mineral deposits were opened for mining, and waterways were redirected to support human settlement patterns. This systematic alteration of the landscape eliminated the environmental conditions that had supported traditional Falmer magical practices. Even if some Snow Elves had managed to avoid the worst effects of the Dwemer transformation, they would have found their former territories fundamentally incompatible with their way of life. The magical currents that had been carefully cultivated over generations were disrupted beyond repair, making any return to surface existence impossible even for those who retained their original identities. The psychological impact of this double betrayal would have been devastating for any Snow Elves who remained aware of their circumstances. Not only had they been transformed into something monstrous by those who had promised sanctuary, but their ancestral lands had been permanently altered to prevent any possibility of restoration. The civilization that had thrived for millennia in harmony with Skyrim's natural forces had been erased so completely that even its memory was fading from the world. Yet even in the depths of their transformed existence, some spark of the original Falmer spirit may have endured. Reports from later expeditions into abandoned Dwemer cities describe encounters with creatures that display behaviors suggesting more intelligence than their degraded appearance would indicate. These beings, while clearly descended from the transformed Snow Elves, occasionally demonstrate problem-solving abilities and social coordination that exceed what would be expected from purely instinct-driven creatures. The mystery deepens when examining the scattered evidence left behind in those abandoned underground complexes. Archaeological expeditions conducted centuries later would uncover chambers that bore signs of deliberate modification, suggesting that some of the transformed Falmer retained enough awareness to alter their environment in ways that served purposes beyond mere survival. These modifications included the creation of crude shrines that incorporated elements reminiscent of ancient Snow Elf religious practices, though executed with such primitive craftsmanship that their true significance remained unclear to surface scholars. The tools and weapons discovered in these chambers revealed a disturbing evolution in the capabilities of the transformed population. While clearly degraded from the sophisticated magical implements that had once defined Falmer craftsmanship, these crude devices demonstrated an understanding of metallurgy and engineering that exceeded what might be expected from beings whose cognitive abilities had supposedly been reduced to animalistic levels. The presence of organized workshops and evidence of systematic tool production suggested that some form of social structure had emerged among the transformed refugees, albeit one that bore no resemblance to their original civilization. Perhaps most intriguing were the acoustic modifications discovered throughout these underground settlements. The transformed Falmer had systematically altered the natural resonance of their cave systems, creating networks of echoing chambers that amplified and carried sound across vast distances. This sophisticated understanding of acoustic engineering implied cognitive abilities that contradicted the apparent simplicity of their transformed state. The purpose of these sound networks remained unclear, though some scholars theorized they might have served as primitive communication systems that allowed coordination across the sprawling underground complexes. The relationship between these transformed beings and their Dwemer hosts underwent its own evolution as centuries passed. Initial records from Deep Elf installations describe the Snow Elf refugees as docile labourers who required constant supervision to perform even basic tasks. However, later documentation revealed growing concerns among Dwemer administrators about unauthorized activities and unexplained incidents within their cities. Tools and materials began disappearing from workshops. Carefully maintained mechanical systems suffered mysterious sabotage, and Deep Elf personnel reported encounters with transformed Falmer in areas where they should not have been able to access. These incidents suggested that the transformation process had not achieved the complete subjugation that the Dwemer had intended. While the obvious manifestations of Snow Elf culture and identity had been erased, something deeper appeared to have survived the systematic degradation. The transformed beings retained enough cunning to conduct covert operations and enough organizational ability to coordinate activities across different sections of the underground cities. Their apparent compliance masked a growing capacity for independent action that their Dwemer overseers failed to recognize until it was too late. The first serious uprising among the transformed Falmer occurred approximately 2 centuries after their initial transformation. Deep Elf records describe a coordinated assault that simultaneously targeted critical infrastructure in multiple Dwemer installations across Skyrim. The attackers demonstrated knowledge of their city's mechanical systems that could only have been acquired through careful observation and planning over extended periods. More disturbing still was their apparent ability to communicate and coordinate their efforts despite the primitive vocalizations that characterize their degraded language capabilities. The Dwemer response to this uprising revealed the extent to which they had underestimated the threat posed by their transformed subjects. Emergency protocols were implemented that included the systematic execution of transformed Falmer who showed any signs of independent thinking or leadership capability. Entire sections of their cities were sealed off to prevent further organized resistance, effectively creating prison complexes within the underground installations. The careful documentation that had characterized earlier phases of the transformation project gave way to hurried damage assessments and increasingly desperate security measures. However, these repressive measures only served to drive the emerging Falmer resistance deeper underground. The transformed beings had learned to exploit the vast cave systems that extended far beyond the boundaries of Dwemer construction, creating hidden settlements in natural caverns that their former masters had never explored. These refuge areas became centers of activity that gradually developed their own crude but effective forms of social organization. Leadership structures emerged based on practical abilities rather than the complex cultural traditions that had governed their ancestors. The development of these independent farmer communities represented a remarkable adaptation to circumstances that should have prevented any form of organized society. The transformed beings had lost access to the magical knowledge that had sustained their original civilization, but they demonstrated an impressive capacity for learning and innovation within the constraints of their altered abilities. They developed new techniques for navigating in complete darkness, created weapons and tools from scavenged materials, and established territorial boundaries that allowed different groups to coexist without constant conflict. The crude religious practices that emerged in these communities bore only the faintest resemblance to the sophisticated theological traditions of their ancestors. The complex worship of Auriel that had defined Snow Elf spiritual life was replaced by primitive rituals focused on survival and revenge against their former captors. These ceremonies often involved the collection and veneration of Dwemer artifacts, though the original purposes of these objects had been completely forgotten. The transformed Falmer appeared to regard the mechanical devices as talismans of power rather than understanding their technological functions. Language development among these communities created one of the most fascinating aspects of their cultural evolution. The sophisticated Snow Elf tongue had been completely erased by the transformation process, but the scattered groups gradually developed new forms of communication that served their immediate needs. These primitive languages incorporated elements of sound, gesture, and tactile signals that allowed for surprisingly complex exchanges of information. Different communities developed distinct linguistic traditions, creating dialects that reflected their particular experiences and environmental adaptations. The discovery of crude pictographic records in some of these settlements suggested that certain groups had even developed a rudimentary writing systems. These markings, carved into stone surfaces with primitive tools, appeared to record important events and territorial boundaries. While far removed from the elegant script that had once adorned farmer libraries, these pictographs represented a remarkable achievement for beings whose intellectual capabilities had been so severely compromised. The existence of such records implied forward planning and cultural continuity that contradicted assumptions about their degraded mental state. The relationship between different Falmer communities revealed complex patterns of cooperation and conflict that suggested sophisticated social dynamics. Some groups maintained peaceful relationships based on resource sharing and mutual defense against external threats. Others engaged in territorial disputes that involved coordinated military actions and strategic planning. These conflicts demonstrated tactical thinking and organizational capabilities that challenged prevailing theories about the limitations of their transformed condition. The most successful of these communities developed specialized roles that maximized the effectiveness of their limited capabilities. Some individuals became expert scouts who could navigate the vast underground networks with remarkable precision. Others focused on scavenging operations that required careful planning and risk assessment to avoid detection by Dwemer security forces. Still others specialized in toolmaking or food preparation, creating division of labor systems that allowed their societies to function more efficiently than their primitive appearance would suggest. The gradual expansion of these farmer communities eventually brought them into contact with surface developments that they could not have anticipated. The mysterious disappearance of the Dwemer during the events at Red Mountain eliminated their primary oppressors, but also removed the technological infrastructure that had supported life in the underground cities. The steam-powered heating systems failed, the mechanical ventilation ceased to function, and the carefully maintained water supplies became contaminated or inaccessible. This sudden collapse of the artificial environment that had sustained them for centuries forced the transformed Falmer to adapt once again to dramatically changed circumstances. Some communities attempted to maintain the abandoned Dwemer installations, using their limited understanding of the mechanical systems to keep essential functions operational. Others chose to abandon the artificial cities entirely, retreating to natural cave systems where they could establish more sustainable ways of life based on hunting and gathering rather than technological dependence. The diversity of responses to this crisis revealed the extent to which different farmer communities had developed distinct cultural identities during their centuries of underground existence. Those who remained in the Dwemer cities often became more aggressive and territorial as resources became scarce. Competition for control of functional mechanical systems led to conflicts that devastated populations already weakened by the environmental collapse. These urban communities gradually developed more militaristic social structures focused on defending their territories against both external threats and rival farmer groups. The communities that retreated to natural cave systems followed different evolutionary paths that emphasized adaptation to their environment rather than competition for artificial resources. These groups developed more sophisticated hunting techniques that allowed them to exploit the limited food sources available in deep cave ecosystems. They learned to cultivate certain types of fungi and to domesticate the strange creatures that inhabited the underground wilderness. Their social structures remained more egalitarian, with leadership based on practical skills rather than military dominance. The long-term consequences of these adaptations created the foundation for the Falmer society that would eventually encounter surface dwellers in later centuries. The transformation that had begun as a Dwemer experiment in social control had evolved into something entirely unexpected. The degraded Snow Elves had not simply survived their ordeal, but had developed new forms of civilization adapted to their changed circumstances. While they bore no resemblance to their ancestors in appearance or culture, they had retained enough adaptability and intelligence to create functioning societies under the most adverse conditions imaginable. The scattered communities that emerged from this long period of underground evolution would eventually develop into the various farmer tribes that surface explorers would encounter in abandoned ruins and deep cave systems. Each group carried within their primitive social structures the accumulated adaptations of centuries spent surviving in darkness. Their crude weapons and territorial behaviors reflected hard-won lessons about resource competition and survival in hostile environments. Their apparent savagery masked sophisticated understanding of their underground territories and the threats they contained. The tragic irony of their situation remained that these adaptations, remarkable as they were, represented only a shadow of what their civilization had once achieved. The Snow Elves who had mastered frost magic and created cities of crystalline beauty had been reduced to primitive cave dwellers whose greatest achievements involved basic survival in the ruins of their former prison. The rebellion that had begun as a desperate attempt to preserve their way of life had ended with the complete transformation of their entire people into something their ancestors would not have recognized as kin. Yet even in this degraded state, the Falmer retained characteristics that hinted at their noble origins. Their enhanced senses and natural affinity for navigating in darkness reflected evolutionary adaptations that built upon capabilities their ancestors had possessed. Their territorial instincts and social cooperation suggested organizational abilities that had survived the systematic destruction of their original culture. Most significantly, their persistence in the face of overwhelming adversity demonstrated the same determination that had once driven them to master the harsh beauty of Skyrim's frozen peaks. The story of their transformation served as a cautionary tale about the price of desperation and the dangers of accepting help from those whose motives remained hidden. The Dwemer had offered salvation to a people facing extinction, but their assistance had come with costs that were revealed only after it was too late to refuse them. The Snow Elves had chosen survival over dignity, only to discover that the survival they had purchased bore no resemblance to the life they had sought to preserve. The echoes of this ancient tragedy continue to reverberate through the halls of modern Skyrim, where travelers occasionally stumble upon evidence of the civilization that once commanded these frozen lands with such magnificent authority. In In the deepest reaches of forgotten ruins, archaeologists have discovered fragments of crystalline architecture that still pulse with residual magical energy, their surfaces carved with intricate patterns whose meaning has been lost to time. These remnants serve as silent testimony to the sophistication of a people whose mastery over their environment exceeded anything achieved by their successors. The transformation of the Snow Elves represents more than simply the fall of a single civilization. It stands as perhaps the most complete cultural extinction in recorded history, a systematic erasure so thorough that even the memory of what was lost has largely faded from the world. Unlike other conquered peoples who might preserve elements of their heritage through oral tradition or scattered survivors, the Falmer experienced a form of destruction that eliminated not only their political independence, but their very capacity to remember what they had once been. The psychological dimensions of this tragedy extend beyond the immediate victims to encompass broader questions about the nature of identity and survival. The Snow Elves, who entered those underground sanctuaries, believed they were preserving their people for eventual restoration to their rightful place in the world. They could not have conceived that their choice would result in the complete obliteration of everything that had made their preservation worthwhile. The cruel irony that their physical bodies survived while their essential selves were systematically destroyed adds layers of horror to an already devastating narrative. Modern scholars studying the scattered evidence of Falmer civilization face the challenge of reconstructing a complex society from fragments that were never intended to survive as historical records. The magical infrastructure that supported their communities has long since ceased to function, leaving only architectural shells whose original purposes can only be guessed at through comparison with other elven cultures. The sophisticated understanding of environmental harmony that characterized their approach to territorial management must be inferred from the subtle ways their settlements integrated with natural magical currents that are barely detectable to contemporary mages. The linguistic heritage of the Snow Elves presents particular challenges for researchers attempting to understand their culture and worldview. The elegant script that once adorned their libraries and ceremonial sites bears similarities to other Aldmeri writing systems, but incorporates unique elements that reflected their adaptation to northern conditions and their specialized magical practices. The few surviving inscriptions that have been successfully translated reveal glimpses of a philosophical tradition that emphasized balance and harmony with natural forces in ways that distinguished them from their southern cousins. Perhaps most poignant are the personal artifacts discovered in abandoned Falmer dwellings, objects that provide intimate glimpses into the daily lives of individuals whose names and stories have been lost forever. Delicately carved jewelry, incorporating motifs of snowflakes and ice crystals, speaks to aesthetic sensibilities that found beauty in the harsh elements that other peoples sought merely to endure. Musical instruments designed to resonate with the acoustic properties of ice and stone suggest cultural traditions that transform their environment into sources of artistic expression rather than mere obstacles to overcome. The religious artifacts found in these sites reveal the depth of spiritual connection that bound the Snow Elves to their frozen homeland. Shrines dedicated to Auriel incorporate architectural elements that channeled and focused natural light in ways that created spectacular visual effects during specific seasonal periods. These installations demonstrate understanding of astronomical cycles and optical principles that required generations of careful observation and experimentation to perfect. The fact that such sophisticated knowledge was developed for purely ceremonial purposes speaks to a civilization that had achieved sufficient mastery over basic survival needs to pursue higher forms of cultural expression. The military equipment discovered in Falmer armories tells its own story of a people caught between their traditional approaches to conflict and the desperate circumstances that ultimately overwhelmed them. Early artifacts reflect the elegant efficiency that characterized their original approach to warfare, with weapons and armor that maximized magical enhancement while maintaining the aesthetic beauty that pervaded all aspects of their culture. Later pieces show increasing emphasis on purely practical considerations, suggesting the gradual abandonment of cultural values in favor of survival necessities as their situation became more desperate. The agricultural implements and food storage systems found in their settlements reveal sophisticated understanding of how to maintain stable food supplies in an environment that offered limited growing seasons and harsh weather conditions. Their techniques for preserving meat and vegetables through magical intervention allowed them to maintain varied diets throughout the long winter months when hunting and gathering became impossible. The systematic nature of these preservation methods suggests centralized planning and resource distribution that required complex administrative structures to coordinate effectively. The educational materials discovered in what appear to have been Falmer learning centers provide insight into how their society transmitted knowledge between generations. Unlike other cultures that relied primarily on oral tradition, the Snow Elves had developed comprehensive written curricula that covered everything from basic magical theory to advanced environmental manipulation techniques. The progressive complexity of these materials suggests educational systems that could adapt to individual learning capabilities, while ensuring that essential knowledge was preserved and transmitted accurately. The artistic traditions reflected in surviving Falmer craftwork demonstrate aesthetic principles that found beauty in precision, symmetry, and the creative use of natural materials. Their sculptors could shape ice with the same precision that other cultures applied to marble or bronze, creating works that captured the ethereal beauty of their frozen environment while serving practical functions within their communities. The integration of artistic and utilitarian elements in their material culture speaks to a worldview that saw no fundamental distinction between beauty and functionality. The social structures that governed Falmer communities can be partially reconstructed from the architectural arrangements of their settlements and the distribution patterns of different types of artifacts. Unlike the rigid hierarchies that characterized many contemporary civilizations, Snow Elf society appears to have emphasized specialized roles based on magical aptitude and environmental expertise, rather than hereditary status. The absence of obvious palace complexes or royal burial sites suggests leadership structures that were more consultative and less autocratic than those found in other elven societies. The technological achievements of the Snow Elves, while less obvious than their magical accomplishments, reveal sophisticated understanding of engineering principles adapted to their unique environmental conditions. Their methods for constructing stable foundations in permanently frozen ground required innovative approaches to material science and structural design. The heating systems that maintained comfortable temperatures in their buildings without disrupting the magical properties of their ice-based architecture demonstrate remarkable integration of practical and supernatural technologies. The gradual revelation of these cultural achievements through archaeological research serves to emphasize the magnitude of what was lost when the Snow Elves made their desperate bargain with the Dwemer. Each artifact discovered and each inscription translated adds another dimension to our understanding of a civilization whose complexity and sophistication rivaled any in Tamrielic history. The systematic nature of their cultural destruction becomes more horrifying as we gain greater appreciation for the richness of what was eliminated. The environmental legacy of Falmer civilization continues to influence the natural systems of modern Skyrim in ways that most inhabitants never recognize. The magical modifications they made to local weather patterns and wildlife populations created ecological relationships that persist centuries after their disappearance. Certain plant species, found only in former Snow Elf territories, display characteristics that suggest deliberate cultivation for specific magical properties. The migration patterns of various animal species still follow routes that were originally established to accommodate Falmer hunting practices and territorial boundaries. The psychological impact of discovering this lost civilization extends beyond academic interest to encompass broader questions about the fragility of cultural achievement and the ease with which entire ways of life can be erased from history. The Snow Elves possessed knowledge and capabilities that could potentially benefit modern civilization, but this wisdom was systematically destroyed rather than preserved for future generations. Their fate serves as a reminder that technological and magical advancement provides no guarantee against cultural extinction when faced with sufficient external pressure and internal desperation. The scattered descendants of the original Falmer who survived the transformation process carry within their degraded forms the genetic heritage of one of Tamriel's most accomplished civilizations. While their current state bears no resemblance to their ancestors' achievements, they represent the living continuation of a bloodline that once commanded respect throughout the northern reaches of the continent. The possibility that some spark of their original capabilities might be restored through magical or alchemical intervention remains a subject of speculation among scholars who study the long-term effects of the Dwemer transformation process. The broader implications of the Snow Elf tragedy extend to contemporary understanding of cultural preservation and the responsibilities that powerful societies bear toward weaker neighbours. The systematic destruction of Falmer civilization occurred not through a single catastrophic event, but through a series of choices made by individuals and groups who prioritized immediate advantages over long-term consequences. The Nordic expansion that triggered the initial conflict was driven by understandable desires for territory and resources, but the methods employed to achieve these goals eliminated possibilities for coexistence that might have benefited both peoples. The Dwemer approach to the refugee crisis they helped create reveals disturbing parallels to later historical events, where assistance was offered to desperate populations with hidden costs that became apparent only after acceptance. The systematic nature of the transformation process suggests that the Deep Elves had planned for the eventual subjugation of their guests from the beginning, viewing the Snow Elf crisis as an opportunity to acquire a controllable labor force rather than a humanitarian obligation requiring genuine assistance. As we conclude this examination of one of Tamriel's most tragic chapters, we must acknowledge that the story of the Snow Elves serves as more than historical curiosity. Their fate represents a cautionary tale about the consequences of cultural conflict, the dangers of desperation, and the ease with which entire civilizations can be erased when they lose the power to defend themselves. The rebellion that began as an attempt to preserve their way of life ultimately resulted in the complete destruction of everything they sought to protect. The empty ruins that dot Skyrim's landscape stand as monuments to achievements that will never be repeated and knowledge that can never be recovered. In the silence of those abandoned halls, we can almost hear the echoes of voices that once spoke with authority about matters that have passed beyond mortal understanding. The Snow Elves who created those marvels believed their civilization would endure for countless generations, but they discovered that even the most sophisticated societies remain vulnerable to forces they cannot anticipate or control. Their story reminds us that the preservation of cultural heritage requires not only the creation of great works, but also the maintenance of conditions that allow such achievements to be transmitted to future generations. The knowledge and wisdom accumulated over millennia can be lost in a single generation if the social structures that preserve and transmit them are disrupted beyond repair. The Snow Elves possess capabilities that could have enriched Tamrielic civilization for countless centuries, but these gifts were destroyed rather than shared because circumstances forced choices between survival and preservation. In the end, the rebellion of the Snow Elves stands as testament to both the heights that mortal civilizations can achieve and the depths to which they can fall when faced with impossible choices. Their legacy lives on not in the degraded creatures that bear their name, but in the warnings their fate provides about the fragility of everything we consider permanent, and the responsibility we all bear to protect the cultural achievements that define our humanity. May their story serve as both inspiration for what we might accomplish and caution about how easily it all can be lost.